Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. If you were to believe what was being said in the chat rooms for years, you would conclude that having an autofocusing Pancake lens on Sony E-mount was impossible. However, Viltrox has just proved everyone wrong. The Viltrox Autofocusing F4.5 VCM is nicknamed the chip because it's even thinner than a Pancake, just over 15 millimeters, not much thicker than your lens cap. This tiny little lens actually works, and it turns out it's actually a lot of fun to use. And at just $99 at launch, I suspect that Viltrox is going to sell a lot of these, and we'll explore why in today's review right after a word from our sponsor. So let's start by talking about the build and handling, and I'll preface this by giving you three areas in which this lens is not typical. First of all, it is an f4.5 lens. That's not just unusual in terms of maximum aperture, but rather that is the aperture. This is a fixed aperture lens, so it's only f4.5. There is no ability to change the aperture value at all. Number two, it is autofocus only. There is no manual focus option here, nor any manual focus ring. Number three, there is no front cap. Instead, there is a lever here that allows a cover to slide over or to open up, exposing the front element. And so when you're not using it, you close that and that becomes your front cover. So unique in some very definite ways compared to your average lens. As noted, this is not much thicker than a lens cap. It is only 15.3 millimeters or 0.6 inches in depth. It is 60.3 millimeters or 2.77 inches in diameter. It weighs only 60 grams or 2.11 ounces. It is actually surprisingly made of fairly premium materials. The mount itself is actually aluminum alloy, and the body itself is made of lightweight metals as well. And so there's not a whole lot to actually handle to determine the build quality, but it's actually made of nice materials here. Now, even though this is small and compact, they have managed to include their USB-C mount there in the mount of the lens itself, so they'll allow you to do firmware updates in the future. There are no filter threads up front. It's not designed with that in mind. And of course, because of that front mounted lever, it makes using filters impossible on it. Obviously, other than just some ribs all the way around for being able to grip it for taking it on and off, that's all that's there. There are no features on the barrel itself. The fixed aperture has 7 aperture blades. Obviously, though they're not moving, it's not so much blades, it's just an aperture shape that is there. Minimum focus distance here is 32 centimeters, and your maximum magnification is a rather ho-hum 0.11 times. So obviously not a huge strength for the lens itself. There is no weather sealing gasket in this very inexpensive little lens. However, we do have a coating on that front element, HD nano coating, that helps to protect that front element a little bit. So overall, it is the biggest things that stand out is it's extremely small, it's not autofocus, and it has that fixed maximum aperture. Now, as mentioned, it is an autofocusing lens. And not only is it an autofocusing lens, it is the first Viltrox lens to launch what is their new focus motor. They have always used STM type motors in the past, or stepping motors. They have now moved to a VCM or a voice coil motor. This is similar to technology that what Tamron is using in their VXD type lenses. Now, I'm also testing right now the 135 millimeter lab lens. More on that in the future, but it's amazing. But it actually has dual hyper VCM motors. So this is a single motor, and obviously it's got to be really, really miniaturized to even fit inside this lens. However, it gets the job done. It is very quiet. It is reasonably fast, not instantly fast, but as you can see here, it moves fairly quickly back and forth, even more so outside. Obviously, with only an aperture of f4.5, better lighting is going to help, though I was able to shoot in a very dim restaurant conditions and had taken some shots of a guy that was performing, no spotlights on him, and it had no problem autofocus in a dimmer lighting condition. Overall, I found that the autofocus accuracy is good, which is very important since there is no manual focus here, but I was able to get good precision on a variety of subjects at a variety of focus distances. You can see that from the test that the eye tracking works quite well, even when I put some foreground objects there in the way. And so overall, I would say for stills, autofocus accuracy is good. Switching over to the video side of things, you can see here that video pulls are nice and quick and smooth. And one of the advantages of moving away from a stepping motor is that there are no visible steps nor possibility of it. And so as a byproduct, you do have a smooth glide forwards and backwards here. I would say that I would like to see a hair more confidence in terms of the actual final focus. That sometimes I felt like it was just a little bit off for some of those video pulls, but overall it did just fine. You may have noticed, however, there is a downside, and that is that there is some significant focus breathing. It may have something to do with the fact that it's such a thin lens. There's just not a lot of space for the focusing group to move to. And so as a byproduct, there is definitely some obvious focus breathing there. My hand test that I do, where I alternately block and remove the view of my eyes with my hand, you can see that it did pretty good overall. Again, there's good transitions back and forth, and I think the only thing that makes it seem a little bit more abrupt is the fact that there is that focus breathing. However, I found out in the real world that overall focus pulls kind of like just where I'm naturally allowing it to pull, kind of coming out from behind something and opening up the view. To me, it looks actually fairly smooth. It's not abrupt, but it's, kind of a glide once again forward. So really pretty good damping. One thing I did notice, which is kind of ironic with such a lightweight lens, is that when I was trying to handhold for video shots, even with in-body image stabilization, I found that my results are a little shakier than what I would expect, and that is because there is no weight in the front of the lens. It's kind of a backwards, illogical thing, but a lot of times you get better hand-holding stability with a little bit of heft to the lens that you're holding, because it just allows you to stabilize more with two hands, whereas in this case, there's really not a whole lot to grab there with the other hand, and so as a byproduct, it's just not quite as stable. But overall, autofocus does the trick, and this is not only an autofocusing lens, it's quite a good little autofocusing lens. So how about the image quality? This is, as always, I'll give you a quick overview of the optical performance, and then there'll be a deep dive at the end of the review. This is a unique design in that it's 6 elements in 6 groups. And I use the word groups loosely in that there are no actual grouping of elements. It's all just individual elements. However, 2 of those are extra low dispersion elements. 2 of them are aspherical elements. So 4 out of the 6 are exotic type elements. You can see that the MTF chart looks pretty good, particularly in the center and the mid frame with some drop off into the corners. The real world performance of this lens is unique, and that is that it's kind of old school, in my opinion, going back to a time where there was less correction and less advanced coatings. And so contrast really depends on the actual shooting situations. So for example, I'm standing in the same spot, but in this first shot, I'm shooting kind of more into the light, not bright light, but shooting into the light. And you can see there's a little bit of almost like a glow effect to the image. I pivot and shoot the opposite direction where my subject is now, front lit rather than backlit, and you can see that contrast looks more typical, more modern in its overall rendering. And so if you're someone that likes a bit of glow to your images, you're probably going to be delighted with this because it does have almost like a halation effect to it. On the technical side of things, there is almost no distortion, and so that's not a problem at all. It helps, by the way, with street photography. You can get nice straight lines. The vignette is, however, quite high. Again, not surprising with such a tiny little optic. It is a plus 77 to correct for it. I found that longitudinal chromatic aberrations were very low, which is not surprising because it has a rather small maximum aperture, or aperture, period. But there is some lateral type chromatic aberrations in the extreme corners. Not much along the edges, but in the extreme corners, I did see some fringing. Now, in my actual test of the overall sharpness and contrast, on the chart test, it's a really short test because I can only shoot one shot. I could shoot it a few times to compare results, but there's only one aperture option here. So at f4.5, looking at, and this is on a 61 megapixel Sony A7R Mark V, results looked at 200% magnification. You can see that the center looks good, not off the charts good, but good. Mid-frame is good, but the contrast is not amazing. And then in the corners, you can see that the corners are fairly good until maybe that last about 3 or 4%, where it really kind of drops off a cliff there and gets quite soft. There's not a lot of acuteness left there in the corners. What I found is that if I was shooting at lower resolution, so obviously I did all of my testing at 61 megapixels, but just to give an idea of what it would be like, I dropped to medium raw and shot a few shots. And so that's 26 megapixels on the A7R Mark V. And what I found is that obviously your pixel level contrast and detail looks higher because they're just trying to cover less pixels. And so this is going to be, I think, a great match to one of the compact cameras like an A7C or A7C Mark II. Bokeh quality, the actual quality of the bokeh is pretty decent. However, you're not going to be able to produce a lot of strongly defocused backgrounds. You can't get particularly close. You don't have a particularly large aperture there. And so byproduct is that I was able to produce some bokeh, but it's going to be rare. But what is there looks okay, as you can see from these images. Colors look fine. I was able to produce some great looking images when it comes to that. It is light that is going to be your big factor here. This is not a strongly flare resistant lens. Now, it's not that all of this is bad, and as you can see in these various shots and video clips, it does a lot of interesting things. Again, a lot of them are very retro, kind of vintage looking, and so either you like that or you don't like that, but it has personality, and you're gonna have to determine whether that's good or bad depending on your personal taste. The overall rendering to images is slightly unique, and I think that there are people that are really going to like it. If you don't like a clinical overcorrected look, then you'll probably really like the results you can get from this little chip lens. So in conclusion, obviously this is proof that you can do an autofocusing pancake on Sony E-mount. And now that Viltrox has done it, who knows, maybe somebody else will do it. But this lens is a lot of fun in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously, particularly if you've got one of the compact cameras, it's going to be extremely portable. But even, here, for example, I have it on the Alpha 1. This is Sony's highest end camera. But even putting it on that, in some ways, using it, I kind of felt like being out with, say a Fuji X100 VI, that there was just something about it that felt very, very analog, very kind of just scaled back and purist. And so I can see this being a hit for those that like to do street photography, for example. You can't get more discreet than that. And it has this unique rendering that is basically the opposite of clinical that I think is going to appeal to a certain type of photographer. So at just $100 US, 99 US dollars, and it's available initially through an Indiegogo kind of crowdfunding platform, and then it will be available more conventional retail down the road. But I suspect that this lens will become a bit of a cult classic. It's the kind of thing that people have been clamoring for as long as Sony has been doing mirrorless, and so it's finally here. And it's a lot of fun. Now, if you want more information, you can check out either my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There's linkage to the Indiegogo campaign right now, and then down the road, there'll be more traditional retail links that are there. And if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. We'll look at that together. Okay, let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So as you can see here, really minimal amount of distortion. It's not 100% linear, but there's really not hardly enough there that's worth correcting. So no major issue there. In this case, I dialed in a -1 to make a very minor change. Vignette is much more noticeable, and that's going to take about a +77 to make the correction I have made here. Now, it's not surprising that there isn't a tremendous amount of longitudinal type chromatic aberration here, because that shows up as fringing before and after the plane of focus. As you can see here with an aperture of f4.5, there's really not a whole lot that's going to happen before or after the plane of focus. So what's here is quite neutral, but there are a bit more of the lateral style chromatic aberrations that happen near the edge of the frame. Now, interestingly here, doesn't seem to be a lot of it at just the edge. It's mostly concentrated in the corner here, but you can definitely see it fairly strongly there as that bluish fringing and then a little bit of orange on the other side. In a shot like this, real world here, you can see kind of what we see on the chart, that in this area here, just along the edge of the frame, it's not much showing up there. But if I pan all the way up into the very corner, you can see it here. There's just a bit of that fringing that's showing up in those high contrast areas. Now, my examination of sharpness and contrast is going to be unusually brief because there is just one aperture to look at here. So this is 200% magnification and f4.5. So you can see in the center of the frame, good sharpness as the MTF shows. The contrast is not off the charts, however, but not bad at all. Looks pretty good in the center of the frame. Mid-frame also, there's a good amount of detail there, but you can see that contrast is dropping a bit further. And as we pan down here, we can see that drop off where it's a little bit sharper here, a little bit softer in this corner. And as we move on down, again, not too bad here, but as we get to that very edge, right towards the edge, you can see that all of the resolution just kind of falls right off and it gets a little bit mushy right there in the corner. So how's that look out in the real world? Well, taking a look here in the center of the frame, you can see this is again 61 megapixels, but at 100% magnification. Detail looks pretty good. You know, there's something about this lens that where there's just a little bit, it's not really a grain, it's just, for whatever reason, everything is not entirely rendered quite as sharply as what I would like. But you can see, even moving off into the corner, again, it's not bad. You can see it's really good right up until this area. It just starts to drop off a little towards the corner. But certainly for 61 megapixels and such a tiny lens, that's a very usable amount of resolution there. Now this image here actually really stood out to me for looking fantastic. You can see at a pixel level, that's just amazing. Detail and contrast looks awesome there. So I wouldn't be surprised if this lens is optimized at a certain distance, and this obviously is hitting it more so than what a landscape image is. Likewise, this image, it's not as sharp as that previous image. And you can see, however, though, it still has very usable amount of sharpness, but it gives you also gives you a look at the bokeh, which it's not strongly defocused, and so it's not nice and creamy, but basically everything here is what I would say it's in the transition zone, and there's nothing that's really jarring or ugly here either. This is probably my least favorite zone right here, but overall it's still not terrible. Another shot here that gives you a look at a little bit more strongly defocused background, and here it's relatively soft. There's some outlining there, but again, it's not terrible. This image pretty close to minimum focus, and so it's looking a little bit better because there's a good ratio of distance to the subject, and then the primary background's a little bit further away, so it's a little softer looking. Likewise here, this is basically minimum focus distance here, and actually this was another image that stood out to me as being impressive, that the detail and the contrast is really working here. And you can see the overall defocus. It's not strong, but neither is it jarring or bad. This is probably a more typical image to what you're going to get, particularly if you're kind of a walk around type image. So here you can see good contrast and detail on the subject there. Again, this is, I think, pretty much at that optimal distance where it shines the most. And then if you look towards the background, again, it's not strongly defocused, but the quality of the blur isn't bad. Colors looked good, and of course this was a nice scene in terms of the color and the intensity of the color. This, I have put a little bit of an effect to it, a preset, just to give you a kind of look at something different you could do with the overall rendering. But I do think that street and just kind of walk around is going to be a great application for this lens. So the big factor here to talk about is the flare resistance and the coatings such as they are on this lens. So obviously you can see that the various blades, the streaks of the lens, because they aren't curved, and so you do get these streaks come off it. And so again, either you like that or you don't. It gives kind of a glow to the whole image. Here with the sun kind of right out of the frame, you can see there's a little bit of a kind of prismatic pattern that's here. But again, I think that this is all quite tasteful. Again, down here you can see that. I'm just showing you the artifacts. You can determine whether or not you like them or not. Likewise here, I mean, obviously that sun right in frame, these streaks are going to be fairly dominant. And so if you don't like that, then either don't buy the lens or don't point it towards a bright light source. Here, if I move again with the sun right out of the frame, you get a bit of a flashing effect, and that's going to show up looking like that. Here's another shot here, and this is right into the sun, but in this image, just kind of the quirk of it, you can see the contrast is held up better, and so it's a little bit different kind of look, and actually I think this image looks pretty cool. So finally here, this is what I saw kind of routinely, and that the sun's not in the frame, and neither is it particularly bright or glaring here. But you can see if you look at the textures here, there's just kind of a general glow to everything, where contrast has been reduced, and I almost call it like a halation type effect. There's just kind of some glow, some ghosting around the edges. But then if I just turned on my feet and shot this direction, you can see it's just a radically different result, and that contrast is definitely more intense, color colors are more saturated. It's just a different look. And so that's kind of the dual nature of this lens. And hopefully looking at it in a little bit deeper way gives you a sense of whether or not it's an optical performance that you like, or at least you can live with. So you've stuck around to the end, and hopefully a deep dive into the optics of this tiniest autofocus lens that I've ever tested has given you a better idea whether or not it's a lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.